Oh, even better. Look at that. Okay, so this will run for roughly 50 minutes or so. The way I roughly plan to do this is to spend hopefully the first 40-ish basically just doing the lecture, and then we'll do about 10 minutes for general Q&A for people to ask questions. I've planned to cover a lot of stuff, so I'm going to move pretty fast. I'll also share the notes that I've prepped for this with all of you, so you can go back and review this, and I'll periodically recommend resources for readings and lectures to watch on specific subtopics that we talk about. I don't have a slideshow. I just have a doc with basically a bunch of miscellaneous notes. I'll sort of screen share this as we go through, but obviously, you can refer to this doc later. I'll put it in chat and all that good stuff. The rough lesson plan of sorts for this is we'll start by talking about the EU, which is a weird place to start. But the reason we're going to start with the EU is so that we can cover some general IR theory that applies to most international relations debates beyond just Europe or beyond just the West. We'll then delve into more specific issues in IR that show up a lot in debate. So we'll start with NATO, we'll pivot to Russia, we'll talk about Ukraine, we'll then pivot towards China and talk a good bit about US-China conflict and US foreign policy under Trump. We'll talk then a bit about the Middle East, so Israel, Iran, we'll talk a bit about Syria, maybe Afghanistan, and potentially the Congo and Sudan as well, because those are two other kind of conflict hotspots. If we have extra time, we could maybe theoretically talk about Brazil, talk about Venezuela, but probably that will be deprioritized just due to time constraints. So let's dive in. So I'll sort of screen share this. I'll just note that these notes are kind of a bit shorthand. They're mostly here just for you to have kind of a reference point as we kind of go through and talk, and I'll kind of add to them as we discuss. So we're going to start with the EU, not because the EU is the most important or even most frequently debated thing in international relations, but because it's a pretty good place to start thinking about general IR theories. So you've probably debated the EU at some point in time, or you've probably heard it discussed in debate rounds. The EU is maybe the sort of ultimate international organization. It combines political and economic integration to promote cooperation between several dozen European states. What the European Union does, in effect, is promote free trade, it promotes democracy, and increasingly it promotes common security and foreign policy. In practice, that means that the EU has a customs union, which means that you can trade freely with inside Europe without facing tariffs. And it also means you can move freely between European countries, and the exchange of goods and services is subject to relatively uniform regulations and laws, which distinguishes the EU from other trade blocs like ASEAN in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or Mercosur in South America, or the African Free Trade Agreement in the AU in continental Africa. And what distinguishes the EU from other trade blocs is that it promotes a significantly greater degree of trade integration by focusing not just on eliminating tariffs, which are taxes on imports, but also harmonizing regulations so that when you're transporting goods between countries, they are, for example, subject to similar health regulations, safety regulations, so on and so forth. The other thing that distinguishes the EU from many other blocs, although not all, is that 20 countries in the EU share a currency. They share the euro. And what that means basically is that those 20 countries, there are, of course, countries in the EU that don't use the euro, have a shared monetary policy, which means that the European Central Bank, or the ECB, basically influences things like interest rates and determines whether to engage in quantitative easing. That's a monetary policy that central banks pursue, where they basically buy up bonds during recessions to try to flood money into the financial system to reduce interest rates and spur lending. A lot of the technical details aren't super important, but what you should know broadly is that the EU is an international body that promotes international cooperation within European states. That's a little bit less interesting. What's a bit more interesting is the logic behind the European Union and what it's trying to do. So there are sort of three IR theories underpinning the EU that have applications to most other IR debates. So all of them are worth talking about and understanding. So the first theory that undergirds the European Union is what's called a democratic peace theory. And the gist of what democratic peace theory says at the level of international relations is that democracies are very unlikely to fight other democracies. Notably, the theory doesn't say that democracies are unlikely to fight, period. Democracies go to war roughly as often as authoritarian states, and depending on how you define war, they might go to war more commonly than autocracies. But democracies are very unlikely to go to war with other democracies. There are lots of reasons for this. Probably the three most compelling are A, democracies can basically never launch surprise attacks against other countries, or at least it's very hard to do so. And the reason why is because democracies need to build public support for war. So unlike in an autocracy where a dictator can just press the button and go to war, democracies take months to build the public case for going to war, which necessarily slows the pace at which democracies can mobilize for conflict, which in turn means other countries that border democracies are less afraid of randomly being attacked. Secondly, it's because democracies give lots of power to regular people through voting, and that means that very unpopular wars either never get started because politicians know they'll be voted out of office, or they do get started and subsequently ended because the war is very unpopular. And probably the final reason why democracies seldom fight other democracies is just because they have non-violent ways to resolve their disputes. So, for example, they can engage in diplomacy, they can mediate their problems, and so forth. So part of what the European Union tries to do, and this is a principle that applies beyond the EU, is to encourage democratization. So, for example, the EU imposes sanctions on EU members that are engaged in what's called democratic backsliding. That's when a country becomes less liberal or less democratic. So in the case of Poland, for example, the Polish government several years ago undermined the independence of its judicial system, its courts, and the EU slapped Poland with sanctions by basically withholding development assistance to Poland. That was an attempt to restabilize democracy in Poland. Similar measures have been imposed on Hungary. And so the first logical argument behind the EU, and for that matter, behind international cooperation, is that promoting democracy increases peace because democracies are less likely to go to war with each other. I haven't written this into the notes, but it's worth noting the general context that the world faces, which is a general trend, of democratic backsliding. And there's lots of reasons for this. So, for example, one reason why there's a trend of democratic backsliding is the so-called coup belt in the sort of Sahel region of Africa. This is a trend where several states in the last 5 or so years have had military coups that have deposed democratic governments. In other countries, particularly in Western Europe, but also more recently Japan, there's a sort of rise of anti-establishment populism. So this isn't just right-wing populism. So, for example, Syriza is a far-left party that briefly governed Greece between 2015 and 19. But the general trend across most states now is a rise of far-right populist parties that are often skeptical of liberal institutions like the courts and the media. If you want obvious examples of this, this might be Trump in the United States or Bolsonaro in Brazil. The example that's sort of much more recent is this party called Senseito in Japan, which is a party that gained pretty substantial traction in the most recent Japanese elections just a handful of weeks ago. And there are, of course, lots of other examples. Hungary is a classic one where there's kind of a rise of far-right governments. France has elections coming up in 2027, and they have a party called the National Rally. That's a pretty far-right party that could potentially win the presidential election, although the EU has banned their leading candidate, Marine Le Pen, who's run the past 2 presidential elections, from running for office over corruption allegations. The other example that you might want to be familiar with is Italy. There's a movement called the Brothers of Italy, which is a sort of far-right political movement that has its origins in the sort of Mussolini fascist type politics of Italy that's currently controlling the Italian government. And broadly, the trend is that there's a rise of anti-establishment parties across many democracies, and those parties might engage in democratic backsliding. So, for example, lots of people accuse Trump of undermining U.S. democracy by attacking the media, by cutting funds for NGOs, by undermining the rule of law, by engaging in the weaponization of the Department of Justice, so on and so forth. And there's other reasons you might be concerned about democratic backsliding. Like one of them, for example, might be that AI could potentially worsen democracy. One of the common arguments that you'll hear for why that is that AI could potentially worsen the misinformation crisis. And the reason why is that AI can basically increase the persuasiveness of misinformation because it can tailor misinformation to specific voters. Think Cambridge Analytica, for example. The other reason why is a little bit kind of odder, but one of the best arguments for why AI makes the problem of misinformation worse is that it's sort of the technical economics term is that it drives the marginal cost of bullshit to zero. And what that basically means is it's basically expensive normally to produce misinformation because you have to actually pay someone or hire someone to write a fake article or Photoshop a fake image. AI can now do things like make deep fakes basically instantaneously and relatively cheaply, which means that the quantity of misinformation will increase while its quality also goes up. And that might undermine the rule of law and generally undermine democracy writ large. So that's democratic peace theory and why democracy potentially is in a bit of danger. The second theory that undergirds the EU that's generally good to be familiar with for debates about international economics economics and trade is what's called commercial peace theory. This is the theory that countries are less likely to go to war when they trade extensively with each other. So the EU does this, for example, by promoting the single market, which basically means that you can trade freely within Europe and have similar regulations. And the EU also does this through things like the currency union with the euro. And the logic is that when you're economically dependent on a country for trade, you're less willing to go to war with that country. The reason being is that war is mutually destructive. So, for example, if you're bombing that country's roads, those are the same roads that your companies are using to transport their goods. And the other reason intuitively why trade reduces conflict is just because trade is a powerful force behind anti-war coalitions, in the sense that trade creates multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations that use their power and influence over governments to demand that governments not go to war. Now, it's worth noting that commercial peace theory is not absolute. So, for example, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, lots of European countries started trading more with Russia. And part of the logic for why countries like Germany, for example, did lots of trade with Russia is if we trade extensively with Russia, then Russia has less of an incentive to do things like invade its neighbors or act aggressively. And the reason, logically, why Russia would be less willing to do things like go to war in Ukraine is because the risk of sanctions would be so high. So that was the logic behind, for example, Nord Stream 2 in part. Nord Stream 2 is a proposed pipeline that would increase energy trade between Germany and Russia. And ultimately, it failed / was struck down after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But what the Russian invasion of Ukraine did that sort of complicates the commercial peace theory story is it demonstrates that countries are willing to go to war even when they are economically connected with the countries either that they are fighting or countries that are allied with the countries that they're fighting. The other interesting question here is US-China. So the distinction between the current Cold War between the United States and China, which we'll talk about later, and the previous Cold War between the US and Soviet Union is that during the original Cold War, the sort of Cold War 1.0, if you will, the US and Soviet Union had basically zero trade. They had some trade, but it was very, very limited. And that meant that the United States and the Soviet Union were basically competing separately for spheres of influence between roughly the mid-1940s and sort of the early 1990s. What's interesting about the modern Cold War, so to speak, the Cold War between the United States and China, is that the United States and China have historically been each other's largest trading partners, although that's no longer true, and tariffs will probably accelerate that trend. And what that means is that the United States and China selectively compete in some domains, for example, in military competition, but in other domains, they remain relatively economically interconnected. And that's why US-China competition becomes economically tricky, because if, for example, the United States imposes tariffs on China, that might be good from a competition or security perspective, but is probably bad from an economic perspective. We'll talk more about that later. The final argument behind the European Union at the theoretical level is what's called liberal institutionalism. Again, you don't really need to know the names of these theories, it's the concepts that matter. But liberal institutionalism is basically an argument that says the international system is anarchy. In other words, there's no international police force that can save states when they're about to be attacked or when they're in danger. But even though there's no international police force, so to speak, states can still cooperate with each other. And the way that they cooperate is through institutions. So there are lots of international institutions that show up pretty frequently in debate. So one of them, for example, that we're talking about here is the EU. Other examples would be the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. This is basically a group that provides bailouts to distressed countries that are facing a sovereign debt crisis. That's when a government has borrowed lots of money that it can no longer pay back. And the IMF is an international body that lends money to bankrupt countries or countries that are nearing bankruptcy to prevent those countries from defaulting on or further defaulting on their debts. Other examples of international institutions that you've probably heard of would be the United Nations. The United Nations was formed after World War II. It's a large conglomeration of basically all the major countries in the world, and it has selective powers, the most important of which is the UN Security Council, or UNSC, which has the ability to authorize and deploy peacekeeping missions to war-torn countries. The problem with the United Nations is that it's affected by something called veto power. And what veto power basically means is that there are 5 countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, that basically can veto UN Security Council resolutions, which means that if the UN, for example, is considering deploying forces into a region that is allied, for example, with the United States or China or Russia, that country can exercise its veto power and block the deployment of UN forces or block the United Nations from acting in particularly forceful or coercive ways. Other institution you've probably heard about is the World Bank, which is a development body. It's similar to the International Monetary Fund in that it seeks to sort of promote international trade and reduce global poverty, but it's more focused on growth in developing countries and lending or providing grants or development assistance to low-income states as opposed to providing bailouts specifically. Now, the logic behind international institutions is that international institutions can basically promote cooperation between states. And there's a common issue when making this argument in debate, which is there's an endogeneity problem, which is to say maybe states are cooperating through international institutions because they just want to cooperate, or are they cooperating because the institution is actually changing states' incentives in a way that makes cooperation more likely? In other words, if you eliminated, for example, the European Union from existence, would countries in Europe just organically agree to enter into trade agreements with all of the other EU countries or enter into regulatory agreements to standardize their regulations? And if you're a liberal institutionalist, your argument is there's something that's special about institutions in the sense that international institutions like the EU or the IMF or the UN or the World Bank really do shape how states behave. And there's sort of three arguments for this. One is just a normative argument that says one of the main effects of international institutions, including international law, is that it sets norms around what is acceptable or unacceptable state behavior. So, for example, most people are appalled by the use of chemical and biological weapons, and part of that comes from the fact that these weapons are deemed illegal under international law, which shapes norms in voters' minds and politicians' minds over what's considered acceptable, which in turn constrains states' behavior. Secondly, institutions create systems to promote cooperation. So a good example of this, well, it's not a functional example anymore, but historically a good example of this would have been what's called the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The World Trade Organization historically has had a body that basically adjudicates disputes between countries over tariffs. So, for example, the United States and China have a long-running disagreement over protections for the steel industry in the United States and protections for the steel industry in China. And the United States and China have repeatedly gone to the World Trade Organization and said, hey, we disagree on whether or not these tariffs on steel are legal or illegal under international law. And logically, what institutions can do is adjudicate these disputes and issue rulings and then allow countries to impose punitive measures like tariffs or sanctions if certain actions aren't complied with. The most important argument, though, for why international institutions work in the sense that they change states' behavior is they basically create what's called an iterated prisoner's dilemma. And the way that this basically works is if states were left purely to their own devices, the incentive to cooperate with other states would probably be fairly limited. And the reason why is because you as a state would always have the incentive to enter into an agreement with another country and then sort of quietly back out of it or not do what's expected of you. So here's a simple example. Imagine that you enter into a security agreement with another country. And the security agreement says, we agree to protect each other if either one of us ever gets attacked. Now, logically, what you would want to do as a self-interested state is not defend the other country if that country got attacked. But if you got attacked, you would want the other country to come help and defend you. Now, the reason why countries might actually defend other countries if they were attacked when there's an institution that promotes security cooperation is because of what's called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. And the logic here is if I'm a country that is a participant in a security agreement, I will actually defend the other countries I've pledged to defend. And the reason why is because I know that in the future, if I was ever attacked, I would want these countries to come to my defense. So if today I don't come rushing to this other country's defense, why are they going to come rushing to my defense down the road? This clashes with what's called the realist point of view. Realism is a doctrine in international relations that basically says that the international system is fundamentally anarchic. There is no higher power that's able to enforce order. And that means that states are fundamentally self-interested and their highest priority is survival. That's why they're very skeptical of other countries. They're always concerned about war and they're always trying to maximize their own power. So, for example, a realist would say that international institutions might be able to promote cooperation, but the degree to which they promote cooperation is quite limited. This analysis is very useful in any debates that you might have about international institutions. institutions or state behavior under international law. The most interesting application of these sort of institutionalist theories is NATO. So NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a collective defense agreement amongst a little bit over 30 countries. Most of them are in Europe. You also have the United States and Canada on board. One of the important countries that's in NATO but not in the EU is Turkey. Turkey has long wanted to join the European Union, but it's not thus far been permitted to join the EU. It has territorial disputes, for example, with Cyprus, and the EU is unwilling to let Turkey in addition to other concerns like Turkey's treatment of Kurdish ethnic minorities. But Turkey is a very large and fairly well-funded military, and so they are part of NATO. So NATO was originally formed in the aftermath of the Second World War to basically contain the Soviet Union. It's a Cold War era international alliance, but it stuck around after the Cold War. And the important feature of NATO that you should be familiar with is Article 5. Article 5 of NATO is basically a part of the NATO charter that obligates countries to defend any NATO member that's attacked. So, for example, after the September 11th terror attacks, the United States invoked Article 5, which basically means the United States says other countries have to come to our defense and assist, for example, in defeating al-Qaeda and the terrorists that attacked the United States. Now, the main problem that NATO faces today, even though NATO has historically been very effective at reducing violence against European states, is that NATO is ultimately just an agreement, and agreements can be broken. For example, Poland is a member of NATO, but Poland is a very obvious candidate for Russian aggression. Some people think that Russia might invade Poland by roughly 2029 or 2030, and the concern is if Russia doesn't think the United States is serious about defending its NATO allies, Russia might not care about the fact that Poland is a NATO member because it doesn't think that other NATO members are going to honor their commitment to defend Poland. And there are a couple of reasons why the United States increasingly is not seen as a credible member in NATO. The first reason and the most obvious reason is Trump. Trump has expressly questioned the value of NATO. In particular, Trump is sort of disagreeable with NATO in the sense that he thinks lots of European countries are underspending on defense and therefore don't deserve U.S. protection because they're sort of free riding on the United States. And his actions towards Ukraine, particularly in roughly the first 5 or 6 months of his term, also raised questions about whether Trump really cares about Europe. The other reason, and probably the better long-term reason why NATO is increasingly skeptical of the United States, is that the United States might not be that interested in defending its European allies against Russia because the United States increasingly views China, not Russia, as its main peer competitor, or in other words, the main threat to U.S. power and influence. And what that means is that the United States will increasingly deprioritize its sort of European base of command and CENTCOM, which is the U.S. military in the Middle East, in favor of the Indo-Pacific. Now, this began officially under the Obama administration. This was called the pivot to Asia. The problem is that the pivot to Asia in many ways has mostly been symbolic, and the United States remains fairly deeply entrenched, particularly in the Middle East and to a lesser extent in Europe. In the long term, though, the United States might focus mostly on containing Chinese expansion in East Asia, for example, to protect U.S. allies like Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or the Philippines. And that might mean that the United States will be less interested in fighting a great power war in Europe. The last reason is some people will say the United States is becoming isolationist. I think this is probably an overblown assertion that requires quite a bit of proof. The reality is that the United States is probably becoming more selectively transactional in the way that it approaches foreign policy under Trump. By transactional, what I basically mean is that the United States is no longer willing, at least under Trump, to defend the rule-based international order in the way it once did. But the United States will still intervene internationally when it is in the U.S.'s interest to do so. So even just in like the past couple of months, Trump has sort of become involved in mediating ends to various conflicts. So, for example, back in May, there was a brief exchange between India and Pakistan that eventually sort of came to an end, maybe because Trump and the Trump administration behind the scenes put some pressure on the two countries to de-escalate. More recently, Armenia and Azerbaijan sort of pledged to escalate tensions, in part due to intervention from the Trump administration. The United States played some role in mediating a sort of ceasefire of sorts between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. The long story short of that conflict is after the 1994 Rwandan genocide against Rwandan Tutsis, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, assumed control in Kigali, which is the capital city in Rwanda. Subsequently, Hutu extremists who had perpetrated the genocide fled to the neighboring country, which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Rwandan government, which has been led by the RPF ever since, and its president Paul Kagame has been in power pretty much ever since the genocide, viewed the harboring of Hutu extremists in the Congo as a threat to Rwandan security. So Rwanda fought two wars with the Congo, the First and Second Congo War, in the sort of mid-late 1990s, ending in 2002. The conflict in the Congo never fully ended, and there have always been a range of regional militias and armed groups operating, particularly in the eastern Congo and what's particularly called the Kivu region. That has been particularly noted with a group called M23, which is a Rwandan-backed rebel movement that really took off around 2012. M23 opposes the DRC government, and it's funded and armed and trained by Rwanda, although Rwanda denies that accusation. The M23 movement made some real steam in seizing territory from the DRC back in 2012, but then escalated much more substantially in 2022, and then much more recently in January 2025. And so what M23 did was it captured the two major regional capital cities in eastern Congo. The most famous of them is what's called Goma. The United States in June helped to mediate a ceasefire between the DRC and Rwanda, although the DRC has not yet negotiated an independent peace deal with M23, and that conflict remains ongoing. In late July, or I guess mid-July-ish, the DRC and M23 pledged that they would eventually enter talks in Qatar to sort of reach a full, comprehensive end to the war. That hasn't yet happened. The broader point I'm trying to make, though, is that it's probably not true that the United States is isolationist. It's that the United States is transactional. So, for example, the reason the United States got involved in this DRC-Rwanda negotiation in Qatar, in part, is because, well, Qatar was the other mediator, is what I meant to say, is in part because the United States is trying to get mining rights in the eastern Congo, because it's a very mineral-rich, resource-rich region. Same deal in the sort of Armenia-Azerbaijan case. There's lots of economic trade that Trump wants to play a role in. For example, they're planning to build infrastructure that's pretty directly named after Trump, in part because of this peace agreement. So the point is, more broadly, the United States is not really becoming isolationist, it's becoming transactional. It's only intervening abroad when it is directly in Trump's interest to do so, but otherwise Trump might not, for example, uphold U.S. defense commitments, including to NATO. The other context that you should roughly be familiar with for debates about NATO is European remilitarization. So after the end of the Cold War, which ended in 1991, most European states badly underinvested in their militaries. And there's lots of reasons for this. Probably the simplest reason is just that there wasn't a really large need to build large militaries in Europe. This is what's called the peace dividend. The logic is, if you're not at war, why would you spend a lot of money building up your military? So most European countries underinvested in their armies. The problem now is that there is a very real threat to Europe that we'll talk about in a second, which is Russia and Vladimir Putin. And so lots of European countries today have realized that they have neglected their militaries and are rapidly building up their militaries to deal with the increased Russian threat. And that recognition really took off right around February 2022. That's when Russia invaded Ukraine, because that shattered whatever illusion that Europe had that commercial peace theory and trade peace theory, etc., would bring peace to Europe and would avoid large-scale war in the way that Europe had seen in the 1930s and 40s during the Second World War. So what that means in practice is that NATO members at the summit held in June have agreed to increase defense spending from 2% of GDP to around 5% of GDP. Sorry, is that a question? I guess not. I think someone just unmuted. Anyways, the other thing that many European states are doing now is organically increasing defense spending. So the main example of this that everyone's kind of talking about excitedly is Germany. So Germany has pledged to significantly increase its defense spending. There was a fairly famous speech given, Zeitenwende. I don't know how to spell it off the top of my head. I guess it's something like that. But there was a fairly famous speech given by Olaf Scholz, who was then the chancellor of the German Bundestag, in which he basically called for a turning point in German history and remilitarizing Germany to deal with the new threat from Russia. And the EU is also playing some role in this in what's called Rearm Europe. It's basically this pan-European project to spend around 800 billion euros over the next several years on building up Europe's military capabilities. Now, the question you might sensibly ask is, why is Europe doing all this? And the short answer is Russia. So a bit of context on Russia that's useful for debates, because this typically shows up whenever you need to talk about sanctions or war broadly. The gist is Russia has a very energy dependent economy. Roughly somewhere between 35 to 40% of Russia's government spending comes from oil and gas revenues. The other interesting trend to be familiar with in Russia's economy is what's called no one else uses this. Well, like two people have used the phrase Kalashnikov economy. I think I'm the only person that uses this as a verb, so I like to refer to it as the Kalashnikovization of the Russian economy, which is just a mouthful. But basically, the Kalashnikov economy is just a funny way of saying that Russia's government is spending a lot of money on its military. So about 7% of Russia's entire economy is now spent on defense, and about 5% of Russia's entire labor population is working not in the military directly, but working in the defense industrial sector. So things like factories that are building tanks. And Russia has somewhere in the ballpark of 1 million active duty soldiers. And just to put that in context, over 1 million Russian soldiers have either been injured or died in the war in Ukraine. So when you think about the huge number of Russians that are involved in the defense sector, either directly as soldiers or indirectly in the defense sector, building things like tanks and guns, it's pretty massive. Other context that's useful to know about Russia is the oligarchs. So oligarchs are basically rich Russian businessmen, but they have a specific meaning in Russia as opposed to, I don't know, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk in the United States. Oligarchs are people who got really rich in Russia during the 1990s. What happened is the Soviet Union was communist, so most major businesses were run by the government. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia elected Boris Yeltsin as their president. And Yeltsin embarked on what was called shock therapy. The logic was basically we need to completely reform the Russian economy in order for us to have stable growth. And a big part of shock therapy was basically eliminating lots of communist era economic policies, one of the most important being nationalization of industry. So what the Russian government did is it privatized most of its large companies. And because the process was so chaotic and haphazard, the vast majority of shares in the newly privatized state-owned enterprises ended up in the hands of a small number of fairly well-connected people who today are known as the oligarchs. And those people have substantial influence in Russia. However, Putin has lots of influence over the oligarchs. And the meme that you've probably seen online is just about every time an oligarch tries to speak out against Putin, they mysteriously get shot in the back of the head 5 times, and it's ruled a suicide, or they fall out of a 7th-story building window. And the sort of gist that most people think that's true of the Kremlin, i.e. the Russian government, is that there's sort of a quid pro quo between Putin, the Russian president, and oligarchs in Russia, which is that basically Putin will let the oligarchs retain their economic power and political heft so long as they are supportive of his regime and don't oppose, for example, the war in Ukraine, even though very many oligarchs have been personally harmed by sanctions. Let's talk about sanctions briefly. So most of you are probably aware that in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. We'll talk about the history a bit more in a sec. After the invasion, the West imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia. Those included sanctions on Russia's oil sector, its gas industry. They targeted specific oligarchs. They targeted Putin himself. They targeted the Russian banking sector, and lots of Western companies fled from the Russian economy and closed down shop. Now, the issue is that sanctions have not devastated the Russian economy nearly as much as people would have hoped. For one reason, Russia just sells more of its goods, especially oil and gas, to other countries. 2 of the major countries that Russia trades with increasingly are China and India. Interestingly, the India dimension might soon change. And the reason why is that as Trump sort of pivots away from his bromance with Putin, Trump is now very frustrated with Russia's refusal to end the war, and he's basically threatened to impose increased tariffs on India if India continues to purchase oil from Russia. Other sanctions have been relatively less effective because Russia has found ways around sanctions. So, for example, the United States imposed sanctions on the Russian banking sector and the use of the US dollar. The problem is that Russia has alternative systems to, for example, conduct payments with other countries, and it has its own sort of equivalent of what's called the SWIFT banking system, which is a messaging system that banks use to communicate payments, called the SPFS, which is basically the Russian equivalent of SWIFT. All of this basically means that Russia has blunted the impact of sanctions, and its economy, although probably weaker in some ways than pre-2022, has rebounded more strongly than people would probably have liked. Putin himself is an interesting leader. He's a former intelligence officer from the KGB. Lots of people think he's very obsessed with recreating the Soviet Union and sort of rebuilding the Russian Empire. He sort of famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, and lots of people think that might partially explain the invasion of Ukraine. The most important thing to know about Putin and the Russian government more broadly is that it's a personalist dictatorship, which basically means Putin has almost unilateral control over the Russian government and the Russian military. He has a huge cult of personality. He's rigged multiple elections and amended the constitution to extend his stay in power. And he's eliminated most major rivals, the most famous of those being Alexei Navalny, a Russian dissident who was killed when he returned to Russia. And the reason why this is important is sort of twofold. First is the fact that Putin is basically the sole person controlling the Russian government creates risks of erratic foreign policy. So, for example, there's pretty credible reporting that Putin is a very paranoid leader. Famously, you might have seen pictures of Putin during COVID where he would meet with people at this like 50-foot long wooden desk. And the reason why is he was terrified of getting COVID and getting ill. And other examples of this are like he basically didn't talk in person with anyone for basically a year during COVID. And so lots of people worry if Putin is a very irrational and paranoid and almost schizophrenic leader, it's possible he'll make very erratic decisions. So, for example, it probably would be a very dumb idea for Russia to invade Poland or Lithuania or Estonia. But he might do it if he, for example, is surrounded by yes men who are giving him the information he wants to hear, and if he's acting in a very irrational way. The other concern is because Putin's dictatorship is so personally built around him, when Putin dies, the Russian government will probably be very unstable, and that could potentially risk, for example, a civil war or major regime instability in Russia. One thing that's relating to Putin that's a general theory that's very useful for debating IR is what's called selectorate theory. It's possible you've heard of this. In my opinion, it's probably the one bit of academic jargon that you should become familiar with because I think it's a fantastic theory for debate. Selectorate theory is basically a way of understanding why politicians make the decisions that they make. In other words, why do governments act the way they act? And the gist of selectorate theory is governments make decisions based on who keeps them in power. So, for example, why do democratically elected politicians pass the laws that they pass? Well, politicians are elected into office, and so they are ultimately responsible to the people because the people can remove them in the subsequent election. And of course, politicians also have other allegiances, like they might have allegiances to their donors who give them campaign contributions. But broadly in a democracy, it's pretty clear who you as a politician depend on for power. It's a bit more complicated in dictatorships. So in lots of debates about dictatorships, people will say, well, the big thing that drives dictators' behavior is their fear of being toppled in a revolution. And that's kind of true. But the more accurate statement is that the real thing that terrifies dictators is losing the loyalty of the military. And the reason why is that if you're a dictator, a popular revolution isn't game over for you as long as the military is there to suppress it. But if the military turns on you and doesn't agree to support your regime, well, that's when you're more likely to be ousted. And the other reason the military's loyalty is important is because you can plausibly be ousted by a military coup, as has happened to several democratically elected leaders, for example, in West African states like Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso in the last roughly 5 years. And what that means is that dictators ultimately derive their power not from the regular people, but they ultimately derive their power from the loyalty of the security apparatus, like the military and the police. And what's important is A, dictators need to have a large security force to ensure they can suppress popular revolution. But more importantly, B, dictators need to make sure the military doesn't turn the guns on the dictator. And that means that militaries are often very well paid and lots of money is extracted in dictatorships and funneled into the security apparatus to ensure, for example, that soldiers don't feel the need to mutiny or revolt. And it also means that most militaries in dictatorial states are very indoctrinated. So, for example, maybe part of the reason why the Russian military went along with the invasion of Ukraine so unquestioningly is because Putin understands that he needs the loyalty of the security apparatus, and that's probably why the security apparatus is so tightly indoctrinated. Selectorate theory broadly then says the best way to analyze dictators' decision-making is to basically ask what will make the military more or less loyal to a dictator, and that in turn will influence what the dictator does. For example, the dictator probably does need to care about things like the overall state of the economy to make sure they have enough resources to bribe the right generals and pay the soldiers their salaries. Quick things on Ukraine, and then we'll pivot to China and then wrap this up. Ukraine was given independence in 1991, but Russia reasserted control over parts of Ukraine back in 2014 when it annexed Crimea, which is a small part of Ukraine. Why is Russia interested in Ukraine? It might be because Russia, and in particular Putin, thinks that Russia has a legitimate claim to Ukraine based on cultural or linguistic ties. It might also be because of what's called NATO expansion. Remember, NATO is the Western security bloc that was formed during the Cold War. NATO has expanded into Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War, and in 2008 issued a statement that basically said Ukraine one day will join NATO. Russia dislikes NATO expansion because it views NATO as a threat. Now, NATO says we're not a threat, we're a defensive collective security agreement, but Russia says, well, look at what you did in 1999 in Serbia when NATO bombed the Serbian government for sort of attempting a genocide in Kosovo, or look at what NATO did in Libya in 2011 when NATO bombed Gaddafi's regime in Libya in order to oust a fairly brutally repressive dictator from power. And the point that Russia says is we're not comfortable having a NATO presence directly on our border. Of course, NATO says you already have a NATO presence on your border because the Baltic states, for example, Estonia, are already in NATO. It's also worth noting that NATO has further expanded since Russia invaded Ukraine. For example, that's what caused Finland and Sweden to join NATO back in 2022 and ultimately accede in 2024. Some useful context on the current state of the war. Roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory is currently held by Russia, and it's unlikely that Ukraine makes substantial strides in recapturing territory. The last major attempt Ukraine made at recapturing territory came between June and August 2023, and that offensive was largely ineffective, and Russia repelled most of the attacks. The other useful spec to know is that the war in Ukraine is increasingly dominated by drones. There's a statistic that the New York Times reported on a couple of months back that something like 70% of all casualties in the war these days are caused by drones. Not by tanks, not by missiles, not by artillery. They're caused by drones. And this is fundamentally transforming warfare in a way that probably will influence how future wars, like potentially a war over Taiwan, are fought. The very specific update for this month, i.e. August 2025, that you might want to be familiar with is that Trump's stance on Putin is shifting. So for the first roughly 4 to 5 months of Trump's presidency, Trump was pretty appeasing towards Putin. In fact, Putin actually commissioned a Russian artist to paint a picture of Trump after the July 2024 assassination attempt and gave it to Steve Witkoff, who is sort of Trump's basically messenger boy / foreign envoy. Now, increasingly, there's a U-turn going on in Washington where Trump really wants to get an end to the war. Remember that during the campaign, he said that he would end the war in the first 24 or 48 hours of his term. And so now there's lots of pressure from Trump for Russia to end the war. So, for example, Trump has pledged to impose tariffs on Russian goods, especially Russian fertilizers coming into the United States, unless Putin agrees to end the war. And he's increasingly supported military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine in sort of a pivot from his previous stance of being very skeptical of all of this. The persistent disagreement, of course, between the EU and the United States is that the United States says we'll negotiate an end to this war somewhat unilaterally, i.e. just going through Russia. Most European states, most notably France, support direct Ukrainian involvement in these talks. So, for example, Trump and Putin are scheduled to meet sometime next week in Alaska. Ukraine will not be directly involved in those discussions. So that's the general context on Ukraine that you should be familiar with. Last 5 or 10 minutes or so that we have, and then we'll sort of wrap this up, is chatting a bit about China. So some things that you should know about China from an international relations perspective. The first thing that you should know is that China's government is increasingly personalist in that power is consolidated around Xi Jinping, who is the paramount leader in China, which means that he basically controls the Communist Party, he controls the military called the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and he controls the government as the president of the PRC, or People's Republic of China. Notably, Xi Jinping has consolidated power in a fairly unprecedented way that China hasn't really seen since the days of Mao Zedong, who died in the 1970s after being China's first leader through the 50s and 60s. So, for example, the most powerful organ in the Chinese government is called the Standing Committee, or PSC. There are 7 people on the Standing Committee, and those are sort of the 7 most powerful people in the Chinese government. And the Standing Committee historically has been divided between multiple factions of Chinese politics. It is increasingly consolidated under Xi. So Xi has packed the Standing Committee with loyalists. Xi has also done this through a large-scale corruption purge. So something like 2 to 5 million, depending on what numbers you trust, million government officials have been prosecuted for corruption under Xi Jinping. This has been the so-called tigers and flies approach of going after both the kind of big, very elite people at the highest echelons of Chinese government, the quote unquote tigers, but also the lowly bureaucrats who are just taking bribes, the quote unquote flies. Now, you might say that's good because corruption is bad. The flip side is that the corruption purge has been a convenient way for Xi Jinping to consolidate power by ousting potential rivals from the CCP and by making people skeptical of speaking out against the Xi Jinping party line. Xi Jinping, in terms of what he actually supports, is fairly skeptical of the private sector. So unlike previous more liberal Chinese leaders like Deng Xiaoping, for example, or Hu Jintao, he's cracked down pretty extensively on the private sector in China. So for example, he's cracked down on China's very well-known tech sector. He's cracked down on billionaires like Jack Ma, who sort of co-founded and led Alibaba for quite a long time. He cracked down on private property developers like Evergrande. And the reason for this, arguably, is that Xi Jinping is very power obsessed in the sense that his aim is to consolidate influence and views a vibrant, thriving private sector as an implicit challenge to the dominance of the Communist Party and to the Chinese government writ large. Quick comment, by the way, on the phrase CCP. It is really untrue that China is communist. China is far more capitalist than it is communist. It just calls itself communist as sort of owing to its historical outbirth from the Chinese Communist Party's revolutionary fight against the Kuomintang nationalists in the 40s, which we'll chat about in a second. The main thing that gets discussed in IR debates is China's international role. China is increasingly interested in asserting itself on the global stage. It views itself as a rising power intent on undermining U.S. hegemony in the U.S.-led international order. The main example of that is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a roughly $1 trillion project in about 150, I think it's like 148 now, countries. And basically what the Belt and Road Initiative is basically a huge infrastructure project where China partners with countries to invest into things like building roads and bridges and dams and 5G networks. Now, the main criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative is that it results in what's called debt-trapped diplomacy, in which China burdens countries with tons of debt that they can't pay back. And then when countries default on that debt, China seizes the underlying infrastructure as collateral. So, for example, if you lend money to Sri Lanka to build a port and Sri Lanka can't repay the loan, China just seizes the port. That criticism is a bit overblown, and empirically it's a bit skeptical. There are much better criticisms of the BRI. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative often results in fairly inefficient or unproductive infrastructure projects that run way over budget and don't produce much in the way of revenue. There's lots of corruption within Chinese state-owned enterprises who often play a major role in the construction of this infrastructure. And there's a pretty big reliance on Chinese labor, which often means that when you're building things like highways or ports, a lot of the people that are building those projects aren't domestic workers in, say, a country like Kenya or Tanzania. They're often workers imported from abroad from China. Why is China interested in the Belt and Road Initiative? At the simplest reason, it increases trade because China can trade more easily when it has the material infrastructure to transport goods more easily. And it also helps China pivot its economy away from manufacturing towards more advanced technological industries, things like AI or quantum computing or electric vehicles, which are all industries that China seeks to dominate in the 21st century. And there's also a security dimension to this, which is to say China can use its trade and infrastructure connections with countries as a form of leverage. So, for example, in 2021, Lithuania temporarily moved to recognize Taiwanese independence and sovereignty. China punished Lithuania with economic retaliation, like prohibiting the import of Lithuanian goods, and Lithuania reversed course because it didn't want to lose out on all of its trade that it does with China. There's also another security dimension to the BRI, which is sort of trivially, lots of the ports that are being built through the Belt and Road Initiative might be useful for China from a security point of view. So, for example, you can use those bases to station your warships to project power abroad. It also helps with what's called the Malacca dilemma, which is basically a bunch of China's oil passes through this very narrow maritime strait that's routinely patrolled by the US Navy right around Singapore and Malaysia. If China can build things like natural gas import stations that don't require you to go through the Malacca Strait. That reduces the risk that China could have its energy imports cut off by the United States. I know that we're going to run a little bit over. I'm going to go for about 5 or so more minutes just to chat briefly about Taiwan and maybe a tiny bit about Iran. And then people can ask questions. Obviously, if you want to dip and, kind of move along, feel free to do so. Briefly on Taiwan, context, the CCP fought the Chinese Civil War, sort of a two-phase war, actually. They briefly unified when Japan when Japan invaded in 1937 and annexed Manchuria in 1931. But the KMT is the nationalists and the CCP are the communists. They fought a civil war in China, and in 1949, the communists won. And so this KMT movement of anti-communist nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek fled from mainland China to this little island off the coast of China called Taiwan, which is now called the Republic of China. Now, since 1979, the United States has not recognized Taiwan. It continues to support what it calls the One China policy, which basically is recognizing the PRC, in other words, the CCP-led China in the mainland, as the legitimate China. But it does have what's called the Taiwan Relations Act, which informally pledges that the United States can continue to have diplomatic ties with Taiwan informally and unofficially. Why does China care so much about Taiwan? Well, part of it is because Taiwan has a huge semiconductor industry. So Taiwan is home to TSMC, or the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which produces much of the world's most advanced semiconductors. So there might be an economic reason to seize Taiwan, which is the importance of its semiconductor industry. But the other reason is the core narrative underpinning the CCP, at least at independence, was that the CCP ended China's so-called century of humiliation. This began in 1839 when Britain invaded China in what was called the First Opium War, and it continued for over a century. And during the century of humiliation, what basically happened is foreign powers dissected and distorted and brutalized China, tore apart China, violated Chinese sovereignty. And what the CCP did in 1949 is reunify China under a single governing and a strong governing authority. Taiwan complicates that narrative because Taiwan is not under CCP control. And so there might be a historical reason why the CCP cares about Taiwan, which is to say it is skeptical as Taiwan increasingly grows closer and closer with the West and views Taiwan as a threat to Chinese nationalism. Due to that, China has built up its military rather rapidly in the last decade. It now has something like 600 nuclear weapons. It has at some point, it'll be 3 aircraft carriers. The famous stat that everyone loves to fearmonger about is that China can produce roughly 200 times as many ships just based on the size of its shipbuilding industry. China has increasingly advanced weapons like long-range missiles and advanced submarines that can escape detection. And lots of people think that this might be a prelude to a potential invasion of Taiwan. I won't go through all the reasons why it's possible an invasion will happen. I've sketched out a couple of them. But the TLDR is that China probably might consider attacking Taiwan at some point, and it's not clear, A, if the United States would intervene, and B, even if the United States intervened, if that would be effective at stopping Xi Jinping and the CCP from establishing control. The last thing you should know about China is that it faces a number of domestic economic problems, like it has a major government debt crisis in which local governments have historically used what are called local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, which are basically financial instruments that are like financial institutions that governments use to basically construct infrastructure and borrow money. The problem is that lots of governments in China are now drowning in debt, and that could potentially create a long-term debt crisis. China's property market represents something like 25% of GDP. And increasingly, China's real estate sector is in big trouble. For example, back in 2021, Evergrande, which at the time was, depending on how you look at the accounting, either the largest or second largest property developer in China, defaulted on many of its debts, and it's since filed for bankruptcy. Another major property developer called Country Garden also has had similar issues. So there's major problems in China's property market in the sense that many properties are losing value and some of its largest developers are going bankrupt. China has a pretty big deflation problem. So while many other countries have had an inflation problem of prices going up, in many Chinese cities, prices are actually going down. That might sound good, but that's bad because what it causes is a spiral, because as prices go down, what that means is that companies have less revenue, and as they have less revenue, revenue, that means that there's layoffs, which means that people have less to spend, which means that there's less demand, which means that prices go down and the cycle starts all over again. That's complicated by the fact that China has delayed the rollout of fiscal stimulus. Xi Jinping supports what's called welfareism, which basically is a sort of ideology that's fairly skeptical of handouts to people. And that also intensifies China's aging crisis. So China's population is declining. This is sort of a legacy of the one-child policy where China restricted or attempted to restrict birth rates when it was concerned about overpopulation. That now means that an increasingly large percentage of China's population is not working age, and an increasingly small percentage of its population is working age. I was going to talk a bit about some conflicts in the Middle East. I'll sort of like let the notes sort of give you a sense directionally of where to go, and hopefully you can sort of make some sense out of them. But I'll sort of stop the presentation there, just so that we have time for a couple of questions here or there. I'll also put this document in the chat so that you can access it in case you want to look over these notes themselves. So there's the doc. If folks would like to ask questions, feel free to fire away. Now, I know that was quite a lot, so probably parts of it certainly were more complicated or a little bit harder to understand than others.
I have a question.
Go for it.
What would be the incentives or disincentives of the U.S. joining a fight with Taiwan against China?
So there are a few disincentives. The clearest disincentive is that casualties will be very high. Most war games project that the United States would probably be looking at in the tens of thousands of casualties, and the United States might be reluctant to get involved in yet another forever war after Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. The other reason is that China is a nuclear power, and there's a real risk of nuclear escalation. CSIS did a pretty good war game on this last December, where they basically looked at the potential for escalation, and the main concern is that a war over Taiwan could very plausibly go nuclear, and no one wants to blow up the world. The other reason is just the United States might lose. There are some fairly complicated reasons why, but the TLDR is that China has made pretty substantial strides in its military, and the fact that the United States is thousands of miles away from Taiwan could potentially complicate the US's response to a war over Taiwan, not to mention the fact that the United States just doesn't have that much political interest in potentially starting World War III, whereas this issue matters much more to the CCP. So there might be an asymmetry of interest here. Why would the United States get involved? Lots of people in the security sector do legitimately believe, like I, for example, am a big advocate of like, should war come to Taiwan, the United States probably should get involved. The simple geostrategic reason is if the United States doesn't intervene in a war over Taiwan, it basically means that the United States is de facto ceding all regional hegemony to China. The reason why is that if people think the United States won't defend Taiwan against Chinese invasion, why would South Korea or Japan or the Philippines or even other countries like, for example, Vietnam, have any confidence in U.S. partnership? And that would basically mean that Asia could theoretically become dominated by China. The reason why that wouldn't be in U.S. interests is because Asia is increasingly the world's economic powerhouse. That's where a huge percentage of the global population lives. That's where a huge amount of advanced innovation is occurring. That's where a huge amount of trade passes through. And so forfeiting basically the world's most important region to the US's sort of hegemonic rival, i.e. China, could potentially be quite disastrous. The other reason why the United States might intervene is for semiconductors. So TSMC produces most of the world's advanced semiconductors in Taiwan in what are called gigafabs, which are basically huge factories. The United States could very plausibly be concerned that if China captures Taiwan and the United States doesn't push back, that would mean China could use those advanced semiconductors to accelerate its artificial intelligence development because AI depends on computing power, and computing power gets boosted with more powerful semiconductors. That would result in further advances in Chinese military power, economic power, etc., which would undermine U.S. interests in fields like trade or information dominance. So that's probably why the United States might consider getting involved. Roman?
I was wondering, considering how China has invited many scientific communities and invited scientific innovation, will this deflation be stopped by that in some sense?
Well, I mean, empirically, deflation has been happening in China for quite some time. So it's not like this is like a new issue. This has been going on now for multiple years. So clearly, the short answer is it's not working yet. Is your question like, as China continues to invite scientific leaders into
And,
China?
and then develop its own technology more and more efficiently, will that prevent deflation or contribute to deflation?
It probably won't prevent deflation, but wouldn't be a major contributor. The main reason why China has a deflation problem is because China has a significantly higher savings rate than the United States. So people just spend a much lower percentage of their income on consumer goods than they do in the United States. So the US has a consumption-driven economy. China has what's called an overinvestment problem, which is to say that China has actually invested so heavily into things like manufacturing, real estate, transportation, high-speed rail, etc., that China is actually overproducing relative to its consumption. And that means that the real thing China needs to do to limit deflation is to spur consumption, but there's relatively limited will within the CCP to do a huge amount of stimulus. That's changed in the last year. Xi Jinping is now more tolerant of stimulus, and stimulus packages have certainly grown in size, but China needs to spur domestic consumption to get out of the deflation crisis. Innovation alone doesn't cut it because it's a demand problem, not a supply problem.
And then how will this deflation affect its scientific and therefore technological advancement?
Unclear if it will. These are somewhat separate issues, right? Like deflation is a problem of prices declining, worsening the youth unemployment crisis, and potentially triggering social unrest. The issue of innovation is increasingly state-driven. So China, for example, has fairly substantial investments through what's called the MIC 2025 or Made in China 2025 initiative to invest heavily into industries like AI, quantum computing, et cetera. So the two issues probably are tenuously related, but the connection isn't super strong. Bethany?
Could you talk more about the Sri Lanka case study for the Belt and Road Initiative? Like
Uh, I'll
specifically
s-
how it's not just debt traps.
yeah, hang on. I'll send a proper article on this. Where is this? Um Okay, I'm just going to send this article here, which explains that the specific details of the Sri Lanka case are complicated. The very short version basically is just that the commonly told version of the Sri Lanka story is wrong. The conventional story is China gives money to Sri Lanka to build this big port. China knew Sri Lanka would default. Sri Lanka defaults. Beijing takes the port. The problem is that that's actually not at all true on many levels. Like the port wasn't even originally China's idea. It actually was originally proposed well prior to the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, the problem with the port really wasn't that the debt was too much. It was just that the port itself was kind of like an unproductive investment, which is the real issue. And the other issue is like the vast majority of Sri Lanka's debt problem has nothing to do with China. It actually has to do a lot more with borrowing from Western institutions. And probably the biggest thing is that like the story that's told about China's seizing of the port is wrong, which is to say that the way that people conceptualize of China seizing the Sri Lankan port is China said, because you can't repay the loan, we will take the port. It's actually not really what happened. China ended up basically just leasing the port. And there are existing restrictions on what China can do with the port. So it's not really true that like debt trap diplomacy is as scary as everyone says. Tejas?
Can you do you know what happened with the China's like aging population? Like why is that happening and like how's it affecting it?
So it's not unique to China. This is an issue that's affecting lots of countries. Japan and South Korea are two of the canonical case studies. It's also an issue that's affecting many Western European countries, the United States to some extent as well, although a bit offset by immigration. So the gist is aging population just mean an increasingly large percent of your country or of your population is old, like above 65. The problem this creates is that as people age out of the working age, they don't work, which means they don't make income, which means they don't pay taxes. At the same time, they need increasingly large support from the government, for example, through healthcare because they have more medical problems. So the issue is that at the same time that tax revenues are going down because relatively fewer people are working, there's more of a need for governments to spend on social safety nets, to spend on pensions, to spend on healthcare, etc. And this potentially creates a sovereign financing problem because governments have less money but need to be spending more. And so the relevant and unanswered question at this point is how do governments deal with that crisis? Do you cut down on spending? Well, that means the elderly people go without medical care and they go without their pensions, or they go without their social security in the case of the United States. Or You could, in theory, try to, increase taxes, but you're already facing a declining labor force and you don't want to further depress economic growth. That's the main concern vis-a-vis working populations, or sorry, aging populations. It's a particularly huge issue in Japan, for example, in South Korea as well. And the reason why is that the easiest way to respond to this problem is you just increase immigration rates. Countries that are skeptical of immigration have a harder time dealing with this. The other workaround is you can try to increase the birth rate. The problem is countries have tried just about everything, and it's very hard to do this. So, like Italy will basically pay you to have kids. Like they will more or less give you like a stipend, more or less, if you have children. And lots of countries have done this. It's a very common talking point to say the reason people aren't having kids is because life is too expensive. The evidence is a bit tenuous on that because there are lots of countries that have extremely generous social support structures for parents. And even in those countries, birth rates don't seem to be notably higher or seem to be going up very, very much. Geneva? Oh, Henry, in the meantime.
You mentioned how in the Ukraine and Russia conflict, 70% of all kills are from, or kills and casualties are from drones. Do you think that would do you think in a potential conflict between China and the USA in Taiwan, drones would play that big of a presence?
This is an incredible question. This is an excellent question. This is a big debate right now in U.S. security studies. So let me see if I can very quickly find the article that I like on this to recommend you to read. Can I find it really quickly? I doubt so. Maybe I can find it very quickly. I don't think so though. Anyways, so the short answer is maybe. So both China and the United States are investing pretty massively into drone production. So the United States, for example, a couple of months ago rolled out a whole new defense policy oriented around drone acquisition and procurement. Realistically, drones will probably play less of a role in Taiwan, and the reason why is just because the war in Taiwan will be largely, or at least initially, largely a naval conflict, not a land conflict. Like the initial conflict will be like submarines and ships and aircraft carriers, fighting for whether or not China can get to Taiwan's beaches to deploy soldiers onto the Taiwanese shores. So it's unclear whether drones would play a huge role in that context. Like in that context, the sorts of weapons that will be more relevant are things like submarines, aircraft carriers, torpedoes, long-range missiles, etc. And realistically, drones are probably a bit more useful for like attacking soldiers on land or attacking tanks or vehicles on land. But drones probably do play at least a reasonably important role. The term that you'll sometimes hear people reference is the term precision mass, which I actually referenced in the doc. Precision mass is basically just there's a pretty good article on it. Let me see if I can find it very quick. Foreign affairs, precision mass. Here it is. Like there's been some stuff written on like the kind of need to have a high quantity of high precision weapons, and drones might be that. It's very expensive to build, for example, very accurate missiles. It's very cheap to build drones, and that theoretically might mean that drones will play a fairly large role in a war over Taiwan potentially. Geneva, question?
Yeah, I was wondering generally how to weigh and argue escalation versus deterrence for
This is
military
a
conflicts.
Yeah, this is an excellent question, like genuinely excellent. So, just for anyone who doesn't get the question is like a lot of debates about IR end up being about we should do a thing that could potentially deter conflict or it could potentially escalate conflict. So, the classic example would be a motion like this House supports Germany's remilitarization, where Gov will say by remilitarizing, Germany reduces the risk of conflict with Russia because Germany has a bigger military and therefore the costs of conflict are higher. Op says German remilitarization increases the risk of war with Russia because tensions become higher, there's a greater risk of miscalculation, and war might break out. So the general rule of thumb is if you're Gov, or if you're the team that says deterrence is more likely, what you basically emphasize is that whenever you build up your military or deploy weapons to a country or whatever it happens to be, what you're basically doing is you're increasing the potential risks of conflict to the other party. So, for example, if the United States becomes more involved in Taiwan, what that is signaling to China is that the United States has both the means and the will to defend Taiwan should China attack, which means that the costs of war to China will be higher and the probability of victory will be lower. war, which therefore makes conflict less likely. And even if countries escalate in their rhetoric, like, for example, throwing a hissy fit about how the United States is, attacking Chinese interests, the conflict doesn't escalate because the costs will be too high. So countries might performatively say that this is a very escalatory move, but they won't escalate in practice. On the flip side, the way that you make the case for escalation, a big misconception in lots of debates about IR is that the way that you prove war happens is you say, country X does this thing, country Y hates that thing, and so country Y declares war on country X. This happens almost never. It's very rare that one specific thing is the trigger for war. The more common thing is that individual things add up and eventually increase the probability of conflict. So the way that most conflict scenarios occur is small skirmishes escalate. So here's the classic example. A US ship hits a Chinese ship in the South China Sea. The United States blames China and vows to get revenge because the United States can't look weak. And if the United States looks weak, it worries that China will keep hitting US ships. So the United States launches a torpedo at a Chinese vessel and it sinks the Chinese vessel. China now feels a need to respond to the United States. So China responds by hitting the United States Navy with, more missiles. And so now 3 US ships sink. And now the United States needs an even more compelling response. And you keep getting this escalation cycle. And notably, this is rational. Each side has a rational incentive to escalate because it's in their security interest to do so, even though the end outcome of war is undesirable. And so the consequence is that when tensions are high, for example, because you've built up your military, the risk of small skirmishes becoming big conflicts goes up. And the reason why small skirmishes become more likely if you do things that intend to achieve deterrence, like putting more soldiers in a region or increasing naval patrols, is just that the risk of miscalculation goes up. So, for example, if you're China and you see the United States deploy more soldiers to Taiwan, you might misinterpret that as the United States acting in a provocative or aggressive way. So you might feel a need to put more boats in the waters around Taiwan. And now the probability that, one boat hits another boat goes up, and that means that there's a greater risk of conflict escalating. The general point you make on the escalation side is that war is most likely to break out when tensions are high, and when you try to deter conflict, you often escalate tensions, and you increase the risk of small things going awry that then leads to war. So that's how you can kind of make the case for deterrence versus escalation. Very good question. Mina?
I had a question about how you would go about winning like a clash of the United States being a worse actor internationally versus like China or some other country.
For sure. So the argument you would make for why the United States is you can sort of start by just identifying that most of the arguments that are made against China are symmetrically true, if not more true, of the United States. So the main things that people accuse the China of are well, China's committing a genocide against the Uyghurs. Fair enough, but the United States has also played its role in historical ethnic cleansing and genocide, whether that's ongoing, for example, in supporting countries that use weapons indiscriminately against civilians, but also historically. For example, it's completely plausible that the U.S. bombing operations against Cambodia under Nixon and Kissinger in the 70s constituted a genocide, or the United States' role in sort of the genocide in Pakistan, similar, or like in Bangladesh, similar deal could be made there. So the United States has historically played its role in military interventions against innocent countries, toppling democratically elected governments in Guatemala or Iran or Chile, etc., or propping up brutally repressive regimes. Probably the example that's relatively less controversial than the Israel example is the Saudi Arabia example, which is the United States sold tens of billions of dollars of precision weapons to the Saudi government, even as the United States knew that those weapons were being used to exacerbate a famine in Yemen and kill thousands of civilians. So you can probably make an empirical claim, which is that the United States' track record on human rights internationally and also domestically is at least questionable at best. And the argument you can make then for why the United States is affirmatively worse than China is that the main principle of China's foreign policy, although it deviates at points, is mostly non-intervention. There's kind of a joke in international development circles, which is whenever a poor country is looking for investment, the West will give it a lecture and China will give it a bridge. And the idea basically is the United States is very intent internationally on imposing its worldview on other countries. Think nation building, for example, in Iraq or Afghanistan, or trying to impose democracy via color revolutions. And so the argument you can make from that pro-China point of view is that China's primary interest is just to exert influence abroad without necessarily interfering in the domestic politics of the countries that it's involving in. And in some cases, that's bad. Like China does a bunch of trade with Uganda, which a few years ago passed a law that makes being gay punishable by the death penalty. From China's point of view, the China argument is like, we are not going to stop trading with Uganda over this. We're going to trade with any country, irrespective of their domestic politics. Whereas the United States might be more interventionist in the sense of imposing sanctions on countries or intervening against rogue regimes. You can also make a pretty fair argument that the other thing that distinguishes the United States from China is people really exaggerate how militarist China is. The last time China invaded a country was 1979 when it invaded Vietnam, and that conflict ended pretty quickly. Yeah, everyone knows the obvious cases of Chinese repression like Tiananmen in 1989 or Hong Kong circa 2019. But for the most part, China's foreign policy is way less militarist than the United States. Like even this year, you can think of the United States bombing Iran, the United States launching airstrikes in Somalia against al-Shabaab, the United States playing a major and directly military role, for example, in the wars both in Gaza and in Ukraine, not directly, but via the provision of weapons. The United States plays a huge role in the global war on terror. The United States just a few days ago announced that it might potentially deploy military forces into Mexico to deal with drug cartels. Like the point is that the United States under Democratic and Republican administrations is very much internationally aggressive militarily. Even under Biden and Obama, this was true, right? Like Biden, for example, played a fairly major role in like for example, like the drone strike that killed al-Zawahiri, who is the leader of al-Qaeda that succeeded bin Laden. Obama's drone strikes kind of got him lots of flack on similar notes. Like the point is, the United States is just a much more militarily aggressive country than China. China almost always prefers economic coercion to military coercion. The United States prefers both. So the case for the U.S. worse than China is basically just non-intervention is generally preferable because it reduces the risks of refugee crises, regime instability, poverty, death, etc. The argument on the flip side is like, although China might be less militarily interventionist, you can probably make a few claims. One claim is like you probably can defend the U.S. foreign policy track record. Like lots of U.S. military operations are pretty uncontroversially good. Like the 1995 bombing campaign in Bosnia almost certainly prevented a genocide. The United States intervention in Somalia in the early 1990s, probably very good. There's a pretty fair claim that says that the United States' role in Afghanistan was on balance good if you think about the net effects it had on human welfare or girls' access to education, and the Taliban being pretty brutally repressive might be an argument for why the U.S. should have stayed in Afghanistan, not left. You can make plenty of other arguments about individual operations that the United States fought and why they happen to be good or why they happen to be beneficial. But the point is you can at least defend a decent number of U.S. foreign policy operations. And then what you can basically say on top of that is that the way that China seeks to influence the international system is to make countries relatively more authoritarian or repressive. Examples of this are like the sale of facial recognition software to authoritarian governments to enable crackdown on protesters, or China providing extensive financial assistance to countries like Russia and Venezuela and Iran that prop those regimes up and allow them to continue doing things like fighting the war in Ukraine or repressing democratic activists in Venezuela or funding terrorist proxies in the Middle East in the case of Iran. So you can sort of make the argument that the authoritarian model of governance in China is spread through China's soft and hard power, both through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also through trade agreements. And that means that China's net effect on international politics is to make countries less democratic, more repressive, etc., because China's ultimate interest is stability. And in many instances, what stability entails is the suppression of human rights or cracking down on democracy, because authoritarianism is a more stable form of government. So that's probably how you can make the case either way. Raghav?
You said for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine is kind of stuck because they can't really invade into Russia. So what do you think is going to happen within the conflict now that US backs Ukraine and UK
That's a
can't?
good question. So I guess I slightly misspoke. So to be clear, in August 2024, Ukraine launched an incursion into Kursk, which is a region inside Russia. The Kursk incursion has since been expelled, but like I shouldn't have said that Ukraine can't make any progress. The point is just that the trend in the war is very much in Russia's favor. The reason why is just like Russia has almost all the advantages. Russia has a much larger population. It has a much larger war economy, so its productive capacity outpaces that of Ukraine. And even with EU and US backing, Ukraine is still outgunned. So the famous like statistic is like Russia every year is producing more artillery shells than the entirety of the United States and Europe combined. People really like to exaggerate how powerful the US military is in selective ways. Remember that the United States' approach to warfighting since roughly 1991, when the United States temporarily fought Iraq after it invaded Kuwait. The US military's approach has been oriented around precision rather than mass, which is basically just to say the United States has prioritized an approach to warfare which prioritizes a small number of very advanced weapon systems. So things like Tomahawk missiles, for example, that are very, very accurate, but very expensive per missile. And the United States has under prioritized mass. So in other words, the US ability to produce thousands of tanks or millions of artillery shells is very badly limited. And it will take many years for the United States to ramp up defense production. The problem is that Russia doesn't have that problem because Russia has huge numbers of tanks and artillery shells coming off the lines just about every month, which means that Russia has the strict materiel advantage, materiel spelled with an E like this. And that means basically that even with Ukrainian resolve and morale and US and EU backing, the simple reality is just that Ukraine is at a disadvantage in terms of the number of tanks, the number of drones, etc. There are also specific reasons why Ukraine's at a disadvantage, like its inventory of missile interceptors is pretty badly depleted, which is why Russia can very easily strike pretty deep into Ukraine. Like every day, for example, you'll see news reports about Russian drones and missiles hitting population centers, even in Western Ukraine, where previously conflict happened very rarely. And the other reason on top of that is just that Western support for Ukraine might very well fade. Like even Trump, for example, is still pretty skeptical of Zelensky. He's called him a dictator. He's clearly not very supportive of Ukrainian nationalism per se. He mostly just views this as a political gambit to appear like a, peace bringer or in his bid for a Nobel Peace Prize. So realistically, the odds are stacked against Ukraine. That being said, it's just very hard in the age of drone warfare for Russia to make huge advances. So what is the most realistic outcome? Either at some point there's a negotiated settlement where the US strong arms Ukraine into forfeiting some amount of territory, although Zelensky will probably resist that pretty stiffly because it's very unpopular in Ukraine. The more likely outcome is that this conflict continues just to be fought on the battlefield and probably eventually reaches a de facto stalemate, which is to say it looks something like the Korean War, where eventually you just get kind of a de facto line of demarcation that separates Russian and Ukrainian territory, and the conflict remains somewhat cold for the future. That's my guess, at least. Any other questions that folks want to ask? Oh, Henry?
Yeah, I have one more question. You said that it's like probably likely that the USSR, or sorry, that Russia is going to invade another country that was part of the USSR, such as Ukraine, in like the, coming years. Like, can you explain more on why you think that's going to happen, or like the probability of it's going to happen before 2030 or 2035?
Yeah, so to be clear, this isn't like my opinion. This is the statement that's been made by a bunch of intelligence chiefs across many European states. So like, for example, the head of he recently retired, but like the head of the US military command in Europe, basically testified a couple of months ago and said that he thinks that Russia will probably be willing and ready to attack another state by probably 2030. The same statements has been made by like Polish intelligence, German intelligence, French intelligence. So there's a decent bit of credible reporting on this. And like a generally decent rule of thumb in IR debates is like when a lot of people all seem to be saying the same thing about future trajectories, like decent chance it's true. For why it's plausible that this happens, the simple reason is that Russia will have both the capacity and the incentive to fight another war. On the capacity side, Russia has militarized pretty rapidly, and by the time the war ends, its military will arguably be stronger than it was before. Even though Russia has suffered pretty huge losses in terms of manpower and tanks, it's also massively built up its productive capacity, which basically just means that Russia can produce a huge amount of war material, which theoretically means if Russia wants, for example, to invade another country, it could. The other reason for that is because Russia is pretty tightly allied with North Korea. Also Iran, but like Iran has been so badly brutalized that by the sort of recent war with Israel that it's probably the less important axis here. And of course, also aligned with China. But North Korea provides a huge amount of ammunition, artillery shells, even troops now to Russia. And Iran sells Iranian-produced drones to Russia. China buys a bunch of Russian oil, which gives Russia money. So you put together all of those factors, like ammunition from North Korea, drones from Iran, oil dollars from China, huge military base domestically, and it suddenly looks possible that Russia will have a huge military, an even larger military in 3, 4, 5 years. Why would Russia want to invade another country? Well, there's like two baskets of reasons. One reason might just be like a, kind of like roll it back type thing, which is, if Russia invaded Ukraine for reasons relating to nationalism and culture and pride and linguistic connections. That's also true of the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and also true to a lesser extent of Poland. Poland has a long history of being invaded by Russia. It's been invaded like 4 or 5 times by Russia. The most recent famous example of this was in 1939 when the German and Soviet governments jointly invaded Poland in September 1939. So Poland is very cautious and skeptical of the possibility of a Russian invasion for much the same reasons that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, the other basket of reasons are reasons why Putin specifically might be interested in going to war. So there's lots of reasons for this. I'll put a doc in chat that outlines some of them in more depth. What's this doc called? Oh, here it is. So I'd recommend if you want like a more proper set of reasons for why this might be. There are some reasons included at the bottom of this doc. Basically pages. It's like basically like pages like 10 through 12. I guess like those 3 pages or so. So that might be a place that you can look for a couple of more specific reasons. The reasons that I'd cite as probably the most relevant, basically, is like Putin probably benefits from war. Like it gives him a lot more power than he has during peacetime. Putin probably doesn't want his soldiers to stop fighting because he's worried about soldiers not being able to reintegrate into peaceful society and then mutinying. So he might just want to keep them on the battlefield. And it also seems possible that Putin is just a legitimately irrational leader who will view Russia's constant proximity to NATO as a threat that needs to be dispatched. And if he thinks that Trump or whatever subsequent US president the US has wouldn't respond, he might very well attack. Bethany?
Well, hi. I just wanted to ask, besides like standard podcasts, or readings like Reuters or The Daily, I was wondering if you had any like specific resources to keep up with IR.
Yeah, for sure. So resources I'd recommend, things that I think are pretty useful. War on the Rocks, WTR is its acronym, is pretty good for like military updates. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, does a lot of really, really good stuff on like modern developments in international relations that can be fairly useful. Foreign Affairs is excellent. It is annoyingly paywalled, but you can get around the paywall if you're very clever. But Foreign Affairs has a bunch of excellent publications, often from very, very influential people. The site that I think people underuse the most probably is two things. A is the Crisis Group, which does a bunch of really good monthly updates on like international conflicts. The other is the Institute for the Study of War, which does basically daily updates on the war in Ukraine and also does general updates on lots of conflicts. Like they do a weekly update, for example, on what's going on in Taiwan. And so those are all sources that are pretty good for staying up to date with what's going on in the world of sort of like international politics and stuff like that. Also, I guess if any of you want to, if you put your email in chat, I'll add you to my current events newsletter, but it's not super IR focused, so it's not super relevant for that. But I do a current events newsletter every weekish or so. So if anyone wants that, you can just put your email and I'll add you to it. Any other questions that folks want to ask? Yeah, Benjamin?
Yeah, so like how often, not just like IR, but just for like information in general, how often would you read that compared to like how often you practice like a debate round, for example?
I'm a terrible person to ask this question because I like don't think practice rounds are that useful, and so basically all of the debate prep I've ever done is just reading, which is not very useful and probably counterproductive. What I'd recommend more seriously is that you just make a habit of reading, but don't think of it as like conscious debate prep in the sense that, like, for example, I'll typically just like read War on the Rocks when I have breakfast because it's like a habit I've gotten into. Is it a bit nerdy? Yes. Is it a bit of a drag? Yes. But like it's the sort of thing that if you can just get good at like sort of familiarizing yourself with just like reading about stuff, it makes life a little bit easier. Some people are really into podcasts. If you want a decent podcast, I guess I can recommend a couple of podcasts. The Economist's podcasts are pretty good. Like The Economist does a couple of them. They're always typically pretty useful, and they cover a lot of foreign affairs type stuff. The Horn, it's literally just called The Horn, is done by the crisis group that I referenced earlier. They do a very useful podcast on what's going on well, technically it's the Horn of Africa, but in practice it mostly ends up being Africa writ large. Ezra Klein every now and then will do podcasts on like US-China stuff and like AI, which can be pretty useful. So those are a couple of other podcasts. Those are again pretty good things where like, you basically can just like kind of vibe and like listen and life works pretty well. Ariel?
Yeah, on the note of podcasts, a lot of the podcasts that you mentioned are pretty like the news based, just delivering facts. I wanted to know, I've heard that it could be helpful to listen to some opinionated or argumentative podcasts. Do you have any recommendations?
Let me think. This is a good question. So I get quite a lot of my opinionated media courtesy of Substack, so I can recommend a couple of reasonably interesting Substacks about international conflict and stuff like that. What are my favorite Substacks for this? I guess actually Substack is not really an efficient way to consume information because most of it's kind of fluff. I'll think. Maybe I can like have maybe Ethan send out like a list later if I think of some either podcast recs, like opinionated podcast recs or Substack recs. That's a good question. Sometimes if you want a decent overview of like opinionated covers of IR, you can look at the opinion section of the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is a little bit more conservative leaning, and some of their opinion pieces are just crazy. But some of them are pretty decent and are worth reading. I'm stupid. Why didn't I give this as the first answer? The objectively best place for opinionated reading on IR is Project Syndicate. Project Syndicate paywalls their articles, but despite having the smartest people in the world write for them, they're incompetent at paywalling, so it's really easy to get around their paywalls. So Project Syndicate has a bunch of really, really good opinionated IR coverage that can be very, very useful. Geneva?
I was wondering, to what extent are you allowed to bring in knowledge of foreign policy and current events without making sure it's not more than the average New York Times reader?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the short answer is like you should never, unless you're in like I guess like a California league where like you're explicitly allowed to like, use internet during prep or whatnot, but you should always avoid using overly specific statistics or facts. Like for example, do you need to say, according to the New York Times, 70% of deaths in the Russia-Ukraine war are attributable to drones? No. Can you say a general trend in the Russia-Ukraine war is that drones are playing an increasingly important role on the battlefield? Yeah. So generally, the reason why it's useful to pick up information about IR is not per se to like dump it in the form of hyper-specific facts, like, there are 149 countries involved in the Belt and Road, or whatever the number happens to be right now. The better thing to do is to be familiar with the narrative, like, what is the narrative of what Xi Jinping wants? What is the narrative of why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine? What is the narrative for why Israel and Iran went to war in June? What is the narrative for Trump's view on US-China policy? Like, those are the sorts of things that matter. So you can sort of deprioritize dropping super specific fact claims and generally prioritize delivering arguments in a coherent and digestible way that doesn't necessarily like require the judge to believe a ton of hyper-specific fact claims. Arav?
Yeah, so for me, I like to consume my information visually. I watch a lot of like historical stuff on YouTube and like stuff like that. Do you have any YouTubers that you would recommend that are good on like history of countries, IR relations and stuff like that?
Yeah, the person that I personally like a decent bit for this is James Kerr Lindsay. I'll just plug his YouTube here that does pretty good stuff. Like he does pretty good stuff on this. It's a combination of history and like current events, but like a lot of the current event stuff also kind of get like, kind of historical treatment and context. Caspian Report is quite good for like let me see if I can find their YouTube really quick. Caspian Report is pretty good for like getting kind of visualized updates. If you're like really into um, wait, hang on, let me see if I can find it really quickly. What's the name of the channel? Um, oh, if you're really into like super technical depictions of international conflict, Kings and Generals is like definitely too techy, but it's kind of interesting because it kind of shows you like the actual like evolution of conflict on maps and stuff, which can be kind of useful. Um, yeah, those are probably the main ones I'd recommend. Any other questions that folks want to ask? I think we've got like 5 more minutes before things end here, so this would be your last chance, I suppose. Okay, if not, thanks everyone, and best of luck in your debates later today.